Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mr. Saucedo's YouTube videos. Today, we're going to be talking about Mendel's experiments. So, we already did a genetic survey. So, you got to find human traits, right, of yourself and your classmates, and we got to tabulate all of that information. What we're going to look at, though, specifically, is Mendel's first and second experiments and kind of what we learned from those. So, Mendel's first experiment. We're going to call this the F1 generation experiment, okay? So what Mendel decided to do was to crossbreed pure purple flowered pea plants with pure white flowered pea plants. And so this is what the purple flower one would look like. This is what the white flower one would look like, okay? So these are the parents. So we often call this the P generation, standing for parent generation. And if you're wondering, how was he sure they were pure? So you can never be sure. But what he did was he kept breeding purple flowered pea plants with purple flowered pea plants over and over and over again for many, 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 many generations until he was fairly certain that the seeds that he was getting were pure. He did the same for white flowered pea plants. So he would just keep breeding white flowered pea plants with white flowered pea plants over and over and over again. And after, 50 generations or whatever that might be, you're fairly certain you have pure white flowered pea plants. Okay, so he wanted basically like a blank slate of genetic information. So again, we have purple, we have white. Now the children of this parent generation, we would call the F1 generation. And so F1 is what this experiment would technically be called. It'd be called the F1 experiment, meaning it's the first generation of children from these parents. So what did he find? He found that all of the offspring had purple flowers. And so what sort of conclusion can we draw from this? That's the big question. And thankfully, Mendel was smart. So Mendel's first conclusion, right? Individual traits are passed from parents to children. So he was just looking at one trait. The other traits that he wasn't interested in. So again, we're only looking at flower color, but he still had all these other traits. You had whether the seed was wrinkled or if it was round. All of those traits, he was still looking at them. He just wasn't interested in how they were being transferred currently because he wanted to focus on a single trait. But what he found was that individual traits are passed on. So there was still randomness in all of the other traits, but the flower color, the one that he was breeding selectively, um, generation after generation after generation, that was the one that he was focusing on. But all of the other traits were still there, and they were still distributed mathematically. So now we know. So again, DNA was not discovered. Genes were not discovered at this point. Cell parts. No. Again, all the stuff that he was doing is ancient at this point, right? So what we know now is that traits are stored in genes in our DNA. And so we're bringing back our good old chromosome diagram, right, from previous semester. But what you've got here then are these little bands that we would consider genes. And so all these little dark little spots here would be genes that would code for a particular trait, like flower color. And so a gene, like we said, is basically just a sequence of DNA that codes for a specific trait. Now, it might code for, there might be multiple genes that code for a specific trait, but we're trying to make it as simple as possible for ourselves. So we're going to pretend like it's just a single gene that is in control of the trait that we're looking at. And again, remember, we have 46 chromosomes. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And so there are, literally millions of genes spread across all of these chromosomes. Now, what was his second conclusion? Okay. He concluded that some traits are dominant and others are recessive. So, in other words, he said, well, purple must be the dominant trait and white must be the recessive trait. And so this is often called the principle of dominance. And again, pretty smart. He was saying, okay, well, purple seems to cover up the white trait in some way, shape, or form for that first generation, right? So there must be a dominant trait and a recessive trait. And so now we know that the reason why dominant and recessive are a thing is because genes come in different flavors. We call them alleles, but you can literally think of them as like an ice cream, right? Like different flavors. So we have, brown eyes or blue eyes, brown hair or blonde hair. And obviously um, there are a lot of other hair colors and eye colors than that. But we like to simplify things to either just there's one dominant or there's one recessive allele. That's it. Because again, it makes things easier for us in the long run. And we'll talk about exceptions and all that stuff later on. But the idea would be that, it's like ice cream. You got chocolate or vanilla. And you might say, well, hey, there's strawberry and there's Rocky Road and there's mint and chip and there's, all these other ones. Yeah, there is. For our sake, we're going to pretend like it's either just dominant or recessive and that's it. So there are two possibilities only. It makes the math for us a lot easier. And thankfully for him, those were the only two, there were only two traits only two alleles that he was looking at for each of the traits. And so a dominant allele will always cover up a recessive allele. So dominant literally just means that all it takes is one copy of that allele and the child will only show that trait for that particular allele. Okay, most scientists would have stopped there. So I'll just say that already is a pretty big conclusion. Like that's a huge conclusion that any scientist at the time would have been very happy to discover. But Mendel took it a step further. He did a second set of experiments. So, and again, brilliant, right? He wanted to know whether the recessive allele disappeared completely in these children or if they were still there. So, in other words, he said, great, okay, all of the children of that first generation had purple flowers, but I want to know, is that white allele to code for that white flower gone forever? Is it destroyed? Did it not get passed on? Like, what's going on with that? So now we're going to call this the F2 generation. And so Mendel is letting the mixed purple offspring. So at this point, now they're no longer pure. The parental generation, the P generation was pure. The F1 generation, we're not sure, right? Because they are the children of purple and white flowers. So again, we have purple flower, but it's mixed. Purple flower, it's mixed. We would call this the F2 generation. This is what he saw. About 3/4 of the flowers had purple flowers for this generation's children, but about a fourth of them had white flowers. So that told him that allele was still there in the genetic code. It was just masked or hidden, or it skipped a generation somehow. So his third conclusion is that parents only donate one copy of a gene. So remember, we have pairs of chromosomes. So that means that we have two chromosome 1s, we have two chromosome 2s, we have two chromosome 3s. And so it's possible that our chromosomes, because they're paired, we have different alleles on each of our chromosomes. And parents only donate one copy to their offspring. So this is called the law of segregation. And that means that offspring will randomly receive one copy of the allele. It's like a coin flip. So the fact that the mixed generation of parents, you're inheriting only one copy, that must have meant that the white allele was still there in the mixed offspring. It was just that it was being masked because purple is dominant. So that explained why the offspring had white flowers. They were still there. They were just being masked by the purple allele. And that is called the law of segregation.